All right, well, good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, and thank you for coming to the Idaho Falls Community Garden Association lecture education series. Thanks for joining. It's the 23rd time we're doing this. Things are a little different this time around as we, as far as the presentation platform goes. We appreciate you joining us here and your patience as we work with this new platform. Excited to talk about gardens and can't wait to get out into the soil. I know we got a little bit of snow this morning, but the days are getting longer and that's super exciting. So these classes are provided by the Idaho Falls Community Garden Association. We're a local, entirely volunteer nonprofit devoted to teaching organic gardening practices and providing space in the community for people to grow things. We do have a board. I'm one of the people on the board. Also like to thank Sue Holt, Sue Miller, Tony and Christy Applehans, Denise Olson, and Elise Hart. And then we do have some on the ground in the dirt garden coordinators we'd like to thank for their hard work also. We do have 3 community gardens around town, various locations, plots available for rent to the community. Registration for these plots opens April 1st, and you can watch for the further details on Facebook, our website, which is IFCGA.org, or on the email constant contact list. We do have an exciting children's sprouts garden program that's been going. It starts in May and it goes through the whole garden season, growing lots of small organic gardeners. This year is going to be our last season unless we have a dedicated person step up. So if you or anyone you know wants to run the sprouts program or have interest, please let us know. Finally, we've had some questions about how to make donations since we're not meeting in person this year. We do have a Venmo account. And if you're interested, just go to Venmo, search for Tony Applehans at IFCGA, and thanks in advance. Just a little housekeeping. As we go into the class, we want to keep everyone muted, everyone with their video off, just to avoid all that kind of overwhelming stuff. You can submit questions to me. I'll be the host as the class goes, and periodically we'll get Jackie going with some questions. And we are interested in sustainable organic gardening methods and practices. And today we're super excited to be joined by Jackie Jamison. And for the past year, she's been splitting a position between the NRCS and the University of Iowa Extension. She worked as a soil health extension instruction agent for the past year. And I'm gonna, without further ado, I think I'm gonna turn it over to Jackie. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you, Lauren, for the introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. I'm really excited to share some ideas, thoughts, exciting things about soils, and I'm just going to share my screen. Lauren, do you mind enabling that for me?
Yes.
Awesome.
I got to figure out how to do that, Jackie.
No problem.
Oh, I think you do. I think.
Lauren?
Yep.
Just make Jackie a co-host.
Okay, I just did that. So
okay, that should do it.
There we go. We're good to go.
Okay, thanks everyone.
All right, is that sharing, Lauren? Am I good? Christy? I think so.
You're good.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So as Lauren mentioned, I'm going to be talking about soil health in the garden today. My position, like she said, is soil health extension instructor with the University of Idaho and apologies there. I don't know why I got muted. As Lauren said, I'm going to be talking today about soil health in the garden. As she said, I work for the University of Idaho and Natural Resources Conservation Service based in Twin Falls, Idaho. So I've been working largely with larger scale producers in southern Idaho, sharing knowledge and helping growers to improve practices for soil health on their larger scale farms. But beyond that, my interest and passion really lie in the smaller scale organic ag. I've been working on farms and gardens for the past 15 plus years. And I came at it from a real love of plants. And from that, and from working on all the farms that I worked on, I realized that plants are amazing creatures, but ultimately food comes from soil. And the more that I learned about soil, the more that I wanted to learn, and the more fascinated I was. So a couple of years ago, I decided to go back to school for soil science and got my master's at the University of Hawaii, of all places, in soil fertility, and a focus on organic management. So without further ado, that's enough on my background, and I'm happy to share a bit more on that. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I'm in the process of starting my own small market garden up in northern Idaho. So I will be transitioning from more of an education position to more of a production position. So feel free to throw out any questions related to any of those things as we move forward. But I'm really excited to share this presentation with you. It's, again, something that I'm super passionate about, and excited to move forward. So here we go. First off, a definition I think is in order. What is soil? According to the Soil Science Society of America, soil is the unconsolidated mineral or organic material on the immediate surface of the earth that serves as a natural medium for the growth of land plants. Well, that's a little bit of a wordy definition. I feel like soil is so much more than that, especially as it relates to growing plants. So I think it warrants a bit more of a discussion of what soil is. If we break soil down into its basic component parts, we find that soils on average contain about half or 50% solid material and about 50% pore space. The solid matter acts as a physical matrix and is a source of a soil's nutrients, its texture, its water holding capacity, and it includes primarily mineral material, so the sand, silt, and clay that you may have heard of that make up a soil's physical texture, and the constituent minerals and nutrients that make up those particles. It also includes, in this tiny little green slice here, organic material. And here in southern Idaho, our soils are generally on the lower end of this organic matter spectrum. In southern Idaho, where I work, they hover around 2% on average. But this number can vary really widely and also can change significantly based on management. That being said, this tiny fraction of the solid matter of soil is extremely important for the functioning of healthy soils. But before I get too much into that, we'll be discussing it a lot more later. The pore space on this bottom half is technically empty, filled with water or air. But you can think of it almost as the rooms in a home, a place for movement of air and water, so circulation and cycling, and a house for soil organisms and plant roots. It's absolutely integral for soil structure. And importantly, it can be ruined by compaction, by heavy traffic, especially during wet times and things like that. So even though it can often be thought of as empty space, it is so much more than that. So we've covered the basics of what soil physically is. And now I want to get into the much more interesting question and probably more relevant question to you all as gardeners of what soil does. So what does soil do? Soil does a lot of things, and I'm going to go through a handful of them now. Soil is absolutely key in water storage and filtration. So soil acts as a sponge, especially when it has a lot of organic matter in it, for holding water. And it also allows water to infiltrate, both down to lower, deeper plant roots, and also down into the aquifer to recharge the aquifer. Soil, obviously, for many of us, acts as a medium for plant growth. It aids in nutrient cycling, especially the living organisms, which we'll get a lot more into in a little bit, are absolutely key to nutrient cycling in soils. Soil also acts as a habitat for soil organisms. And the last main function of soils is one that we won't talk about much in this, since we're talking about its functions in terms of agriculture, but soil also is an important engineering medium. It's what our houses are built on top of. It's what our roads move through. But again, we won't really be getting into that. So I want to come back to this idea of organic matter, that tiny green slice of the pie. Although it's a very small percentage of soils, it has an absolutely disproportionate effect on all of these soil functions, and it has a positive influence on almost all soil functions related to agriculture. It's a theme I'm going to keep coming back to. So soil functions that aren't listed in here, but that do warrant attention. Healthy soil can help suppress pests, diseases, and weeds. Healthy soil, particularly the organisms and organic matter in soil, can help detoxify pollutants. It helps modify the atmosphere. Soil holds more carbon than the entire atmosphere above. And lastly, and perhaps most obviously and most important maybe, is that it produces food, feed, fiber, and fuel. It produces so much of what we use in our daily lives. But the title of my presentation today is about soil health. So this begs the question, what is healthy soil? This question is a bit more complex. Most people who have spent any time in a garden have a sort of innate idea of what a healthy soil is, what it looks like, what it smells like, what it feels like, maybe even what it tastes like. But trying to describe it in comprehensive terms can be a bit more difficult. Some characteristics of healthy soils. These are some general words or phrases that might be used to refer to healthy soil. Good tilth, so the structure, the physical crumble of soil. Sufficient depth, that water storage and drainage that we talked about. Nutrients to support microbial life, nutrients to support plant roots. Free of contaminants and harmful chemicals. A healthy soil doesn't contain things that are going to harm us or the organisms living in it. We generally think of healthy soils as having a relatively small population of pests, organisms like diseases and weeds, and a larger and more diverse population of beneficial organisms, from the tiniest all the way up to macroorganisms, insects, etc. And lastly, this elusive presence of organic matter. So these are all words and phrases that help us define or better understand what a healthy soil is. But maybe a definition will help us break it down a bit further. So soil health has a lot of definitions, but I think probably the most used one is one by the NRCS. And it's the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. This is a short, succinct definition, but it's got a lot packed in there. There are 3 key words in here that I'd like to pull out of this definition and dive into a little bit more. One is function. This infers some kind of action or work that the soil is performing in a certain way. We spoke about what soils do: water storage, nutrient cycling, habitat provision, etc. That's where this comes in. How well a soil is performing its functions is directly related to soil health. The second word I want to pull out here is ecosystem. Ecosystem infers that soil is living, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today. It consists of a community of living organisms operating within their environment. It includes, of course, plants, but also bacteria, fungi, insects, earthworms, anything that you can think of that's a living organism in the soil, many of which are microbial and microscopic, so we can't actually see them, but they definitely deserve attention. And the last word I want to bring out here is sustain. The idea that soil strengthens and supports not only plant growth, but humans, animals, and I think this actually leaves a bit out here in ignoring the microbial life. As another way of putting it, healthy soil is sort of the nexus of, or the connection of biological, chemical, and physical properties. This slide has a lot of words on it. I don't want you to get caught up in that. I just want to point out that soil science, or for agriculture specifically, has focused so heavily on chemical and physical properties. A healthy soil requires and depends upon biological properties, biodiversity, abundance of organisms, etc. The living components of soil contribute so much to the healthy functioning of soils. Yet I think it's often ignored or pushed aside a bit because it is a bit harder to study. Biology is innately complex. And it's a bit more easy to put numbers to chemical properties and physical properties than it is to biological ones. More on that later. Ultimately, most of these properties, whether we're talking about biological, chemical, or physical, are still related to that tiny pie slice of organic matter in soil. So I keep talking about it, but what actually is organic matter and why is it so important? So I'm bringing back this pie slice, and now we're going to break down that tiny bit, that tiny green slice. Organic matter essentially can be thought of as a continuum from living organisms to protected organisms, or to protected organic matter. Essentially, organic matter is organic materials in various stages of decomposition or decay. So eventual breakdown from the living organisms that start it to the decomposed material that ultimately feeds our plants and the rest of life under the soil. It can come from above ground and below ground residues, but a lot of the active organic matter comes from plant roots and right around plant roots. So here I'm going to break down kind of the percentages, and these, take them with a grain of salt. They're very rough and very estimated numbers here, so I wouldn't focus on that so much. But I do want to point out these three main categories: the living and their residues. This includes the soil food web, from plants all the way down to microbes, all the way up to earthworms, insects, spiders, etc. These organisms quite literally drive decomposition and nutrient cycling in soils. And we're going to revisit this a lot more in a separate section in just a little bit. The next is the dead. This accounts for decomposing organic matter. And importantly, this is the active portion of organic matter that serves as fuel for microbial activity. It's readily available that microbes can access it and break it down into nutrients in soil. And this part, this dead, this decomposing organic matter, this active portion of organic matter changes really, really readily with management. So this is one of the things that we look at and that we depend on most in our organic agriculture systems. And lastly in here is the very dead. This part is protected from decomposition by either location within soil aggregates deep buried underneath so that it's not available to microbes for decomposition, or by strong attachment to soil particles, especially clays. It's important for physical structure, and it is a more long-term holding spot for both nutrients and water. So this part is extremely important for structure and long-term stability of soil. So let's play a little game here and look at what happens when you add organic matter or organic material into soil. This diagram I really like. It comes from a resource called Better Soils for Better Crops, or Building Soils for Better Crops. And I have that link at the very end of this. It's a free PDF download actually through STARE. Adding organic matter has an effect on nearly every quality of soil, or every aspect of soil health. And ultimately at the bottom there, you see healthy plants. Healthy plants depend on the soil microbial life and the cycles that are started by organic materials in soil. Observations that you'll see when you add organic matter: you'll see more life. You'll see it in the macro. If you had a microscope, you'd see it in the micro. Oftentimes you'll notice pretty quickly more moisture, especially if you dig down a bit. You add mulch, for example, to your garden and you have a rain event, or even you just water your garden, you pick up that mulch and the soil is noticeably more wet than around it. Over time, you'll see darker and darker colors and you'll notice an earthier smell. This earthy smell actually comes from a compound that's excreted by a certain type of bacteria the compound's called glomalin, and it contributes to this earthy smell. The key point here is not that you understand every single arrow and every single flow of what happens when, but really it's about feeding the soil, not the plant. Agricultural science is focused for so long on feeding the plant, spoon feeding the plant nutrients, specifically nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But we've kind of lost in that mix the importance of feeding the soil. And it's the soil, it's the microbes in the soil that feed the plant. It's not us that feed the plant, or it should be. And so really the key here is in finding ways of gardening that help build up the soil as we grow crops. So help maintain that active portion of organic matter as we're pulling out organic material in the form of broccoli and tomatoes. So a bit more on organic matter. I really love talking about organic matter. It's a pretty amazing thing. Organic matter has a high cation exchange capacity. You don't need to know that word, but it basically refers to organic matter's ability to hold on to many of plant nutrients. Many plant nutrients are positively charged, and organic matter has an overwhelmingly negative charge that helps hold on not very tightly to plant nutrients so that when plants need them, they can pull them right back. Organic matter is also an important source of nutrients as it's broken down by microorganisms. But again, the key here is that these processes are all driven by life in healthy soil. This addition of organic matter, I know that you're going to be having another session, I think next week, on what you can do to improve your soil, but it's hard to give this presentation on what healthy soil is without at least giving a little bit of insight into what that can look like. So addition of organic matter can come in the form of adding manures, adding green materials, mulches, compost, cover crops. But it can also come through the exodus of roots. Roots actually produce these sugars that they release into the soil to feed microbes and start this whole process. The below ground contributions of roots add more directly to that active portion of organic matter. So a little bit more specific here, what does organic matter do? As I've mentioned a couple of times, organic matter is absolutely integral to nutrient availability in soils. The nitrogen contribution of organic matter, I just want to run through some numbers here for those who are really drawn to numbers. And I know that 1 acre is probably a bit bigger than most people are gardening on, but every year, as kind of a rule of thumb, 1% of organic matter on 1 acre can release 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen, 5 pounds of phosphorus, and 2 pounds of sulfur. Those numbers don't seem that huge, but let's break it down here. 1% organic matter on a 1/4 acre garden, so 1/4 acre, equates to about 6 pounds of nitrogen released. If you were using blood meal as your source of nitrogen in an organic garden, something that I use sometimes, that costs about $4 a pound from a quick Amazon search. On a 1/4 acre in 1 year, to supply that much nitrogen would be a $200 savings on a small market garden, just from the contribution of organic matter. So organic matter has all of these great characteristics and all of these great things that it does in soil, but it can also contribute to costing a lot less money than buying. So nutrient availability directly, organic matter directly feeds plants, as I've mentioned, and it's also key to nutrient storage and protection. And this is more in the very dead portion of organic matter that I spoke about earlier. As I mentioned, organic matter has a largely negative charge that holds on to a lot of those positive nutrients, magnesium, calcium, etc. So that's one mechanism by which organic matter helps to hold on to nutrients and make them available. And especially important for some of those micronutrients, chelation. This is important for iron, zinc, etc. So organic matter has this ability to kind of bind in multiple places to some of those metals and those micronutrients, and make them available more so to plants than they would be in their raw form.
Hey, Jackie, this is Lauren, and I've got a couple quick questions. Is it an okay time, or would you prefer them in a couple minutes?
I am going to break in a couple minutes, if that's okay.
That's perfect. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Yeah, no problem. And the last thing that organic matter does in terms of nutrient availability, and maybe some of you are familiar with this, but in Southern Idaho and the Magic Valley where I work, we're dealing with really alkaline soils, so a high pH. Organic matter has this almost magical ability to buffer pH. And by buffer, I mean make less important the actual pH of the soil, because organic matter is able to kind of regulate the acidity or alkalinity around those plant roots. And this is extremely key for availability of certain nutrients, especially, again, those micronutrients. Ultimately, though, if you remember one thing from this slide, healthy soils promote healthy plants, promote healthy soils, promote healthy plants. It's a cycle. You have healthy soils, they make healthier plants. Healthier plants produce more root exudates and feed soils to make them healthier, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really simple when you think of it that way. 2 more slides and then we'll get to questions here. We're just going to finish this section on organic matter. So another thing that organic matter does has to do with water and physical structure. Organic matter helps increase water holding capacity of soil. A fun stat here, organic matter can hold 90% of its weight in water. Wow. 90% of its weight in water. That means that on 1 acre, 1% of organic matter can hold more than 2,000 gallons of water. 2,000 gallons of water and 1% of organic matter. This is extremely important when we're talking about high desert gardening, which I know all of you are in the throes of there, where water can be really limiting, where there can be months where you don't get a rainfall event, where you might not have the ability to irrigate every day. Organic matter can provide that sort of buffer in water. And lastly, and this is more related to structure, organic matter increases aggregation. And aggregation is essentially the sticking together of particles and soils that helps form this granular structure. And this happens via microbial glue. So bacteria actually secrete these polysaccharides, these sugars, that help hold aggregates and soil particles together. And fungal hyphae also do that. If you go out into the forest and dig around a little bit, even with your hand around a tree where there's a bunch of litter, you'll see all these white threads moving through the soil. Those are fungal hyphae, and they physically hold soil particles together. What this does is it improves water infiltration and retention at the same time. Water gets retained in those particles, and water infiltrates between those aggregates. It increases soil tilth and increases those pore spaces. Remember those rooms that we talked about that are habitat, that allow water to move through, that allow air to move through, and it improves gas exchange. And I could go on and talk about what organic matter does. It's kind of endless. And the more you get into it, the more you see. I'm going to end here on the organic matter portion, and we're going to open up to questions on the content so far before getting into some of the really cool organisms that live in soil.
Okay.
So Lauren, now would be an awesome time to open up the floor to some questions so far.
Okay. Yeah, Jackie, this has been awesome so far. I just have two questions. And the first one is, one poor person says her soil does not smell like earth, but instead smells like fish, like rotting fish on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
So comment on that.
So it sounds like usually when you get smells like that, where it smells rotten, it usually is a symptom that your soil has gone anaerobic, which essentially means that your soil doesn't have enough oxygen in it. It means that those pore spaces, instead of being filled with air, are starting to get filled with either small soil particles or water. And guess what the solution is to that? Adding organic matter, ultimately. Adding organic matter in the form of mulches, in the form of compost, and in the form of plant roots. I've seen a lot of great success with tap-rooted plants, like even planting a cover crop that includes a lot of brassicas like radishes. Daikon radish are a really great thing to plant in that, because they'll start growing down and making these large biopores in soils that allow more air to get down into the channels in the soil and start kind of breaking that up.
Okay, great. All right. So one person was asking, does the type of organic matter, back when you had the slide about the numbers, does the type of organic matter make a difference in the numbers? And she said straw versus wood chips versus compost, and then could you ever add too much organic matter?
So good questions on both of that. The type of organic matter does matter, and also it doesn't. It does matter in that different types of organic matter are going to have a different ratio of carbon to nitrogen, which you may have heard about in relationship to composting. So a higher amount of carbon, things like wood chips and things like straw, generally things that are brown, you can think of brown and drier, you can think of as being higher on the carbon spectrum. And you can look up online the exact ratios of different residues and organic materials and carbon to nitrogen. But those higher carbon materials are going to take a longer time to break down in your soil. So if you add a more balanced ratio of carbon to nitrogen, so brown to green or manures mixed in there, leguminous crops are generally a lower ratio of carbon to nitrogen. Those feed microbes directly as they are without having to be broken down further by fungi, by actinomycetes, etc. So those higher carbon aren't bad necessarily, but just know that they're going to take a longer time to break down. If you want faster breakdown in your soil, you want a more balanced ratio of carbon to nitrogen. General rule of thumb, if you're looking up specific residues online, etc., or if you want to talk more through this with me, I'm happy to. The general rule of thumb is that microbes prefer a diet of about 10-to-1 carbon to nitrogen. And the second part of that question, Lauren, remind me again?
Yeah, can you ever add too much organic matter?
Too much organic matter, that is a good question. And in my mind, the short answer is no, with some caveats. Certain pest organisms, voles especially, really like living in organic mulches. And so if voles or things like that are an issue, you may want to keep that organic matter, especially if you're using it as mulch, a little bit farther away from the base of plants to avoid damage to the actual plants themselves. And kind of getting at both of those questions, the can you add too much and does it matter what type of organic matter? I didn't mention the other end of that spectrum, the high nitrogen content can sometimes burn plants. So if you add, for example, raw manures, like if you were to add chicken manure straight to your plants, it can what's called burn your plants by a higher, like too high of a concentration of nitrogen. So too much of certain types can be harmful.
Okay, well, that's great. Maybe on that line, you say the ideal ratio for carbon to nitrogen is 10-to-1. How does that inform the ideal OM recipe? Does that make sense?
OM recipe.
Organic matter?
Right, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, I'll see if the person adds some more. Do you have recommendations for using cover crops to increase the organic matter, or is that coming up?
Absolutely. And so I didn't include a ton of information on cover crops in this because I know you're going to be getting a lot more of that next week. But cover crops and living plants in the ground are an absolutely amazing way to add organic matter. It's like an IV directly into
Nice.
the soil, cover crop roots. So
Great.
it's one of the best ways.
Yeah. Do you just cover the organic matter over your soil, or should you turn it in? I know tilling isn't very good, but if your soil is rock hard, how do you help the matter settle into your soil?
So I think there are a lot of purists out there who would say never till your soil. And while I stick strongly to the principle of minimum reduced and if possible, no tillage, sometimes in really extreme situations, you do need to jumpstart things, or it can be really helpful to jumpstart things one time. So, if you're starting with an extremely compacted soil, yes, you could start with no-till and get to this spot in maybe 5 years where your soils have really great tilth and really great structure just by the action of insects and especially earthworms bringing organic matter down. But sometimes if your soils are really bad, tillage to jumpstart the system isn't a bad thing. It's just continuous dependence on that tillage that becomes a bigger issue, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, this is great, Jackie. I think that kind of sums up our questions for now. If you want to move on, and then we'll move on.
Sounds good. Thanks for all the great questions so far.
Oh, awesome.
All right. Now we get to move into the fun players in soils. So who are these living organisms that, whatever it was, 5 to 10% of organic matter? These living organisms are extremely important. And this diagram is kind of intentionally complex. And I'm going to quiz you all on it at the end of this. Just kidding. No, this diagram is complex. The soil food web, when it's healthy, is complex. But what I want to really give to you here isn't what this organism does or that organism does, although we will get into that just because it's so cool. But what I really want you to take away from this is biological diversity. In this case, and in a healthy food web, soil food web, multiple organisms are accomplishing each important step or energy transfer in the food web. This sort of multifaceted accomplishment of different goals within the food web leads to resilience. Resilience, I think, is a word that's thrown around a lot, but at its simplest, resilience is the ability of a system to recover after a disturbance. Our soils and agriculture go through disturbance every time we plant, every time we pull out a harvest, etc. It's inherently a part of how we garden. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We have to have a really healthy soil food web, a resilient soil food web that can come back from that even stronger. Although the food web is complex, as I mentioned, and as you can see, it all comes back to what are called trophic levels. And I taught biology in a different life. I taught high school biology. And so I know that this is taught in schools, and maybe it'll come back to you as I'm talking about it. But trophic levels are basically like feeding levels in the soil food web. And it all comes back in the soil food web to the first trophic level of primary producers. These guys are organisms that are able to make their own food. Let's stop for a second and think about how cool that is, that organisms are able to make their own food. They don't have to go to the grocery store. They don't have to grow their own. These are plants. They're able to photosynthesize and literally turn sunlight and water into sugar, into food. Some microorganisms can do it too. Cyanobacteria, algae, things like that. So ultimately, the soil food web all comes down in that left-hand bottom corner to the primary producers and the residues that they produce. The second trophic level feeds directly on these primary producers, or first trophic level. They eat plants. They eat plants dead or alive. So if they're eating dead plants, they're called saprotrophs or decomposers. Or they eat products of plants like sugars. So this includes the little bacteria that feed on the sugars produced by little roots. You can think of these kind of as the soil herbivores, although it doesn't necessarily fit the common use of that term. It also includes some really important folks that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes that feed directly on sugars produced by plants and that form what are called symbiotic or mutualistic relationships with plant roots. Two of them that are really, really important that we're going to talk about are mycorrhizae, which are a type of fungi, and rhizobia, a type of bacteria. And they receive from their association with plants the sugars that plants produce directly. And we can't forget about the top trophic levels, the upper trophic levels, third, fourth, fifth, etc. And these guys feed on organisms at lower trophic levels. So these are predators, but they're also grazers. They're organisms that feed on the bacteria that feed on plants. And these are really important because at each step in the food chain, or at each energy transfer in the food web, nutrients and energy are released. Those green arrows on this diagram represent directly the release of nutrients and energy. So every time something is eaten, every time something has a meal, they release nutrients that plants can use. And again, I just want to bring it back in this complex diagram that the key is really diversity. I'm going to throw out a couple of numbers here because they're kind of shocking. In soil, you can have 100 million to a billion bacteria. A billion. Several yards of fungi, several thousand protozoa, nematodes, fungal feeding organisms, etc. So there's a huge diversity just in a tablespoon of soil. So this is a little bit of a simpler soil food web. You may have seen this before. I think this is pretty similar to the one that Dr. Elaine Ingham shows. But it more kind of simply lays out the different trophic levels. And I really like this quote at the bottom here. It's another definition for soils that I think gets at more the function of soils in agriculture and for humans to use. Soil is a living factory of macroscopic and microscopic workers who need food to eat and places to do their work. So it's simple. It comes down to food to eat and places to do their work. Habitat. So in addition to producing food, I don't think this is thought of a lot, but I think it's a really cool concept. The gardeners and farmers, when they're doing it this way, are also micro livestock farmers. We're growing bacteria and fungi and nematodes and protozoa and insects and earthworms. Our goal is not to, I think that I had a really big kind of revelation moment when I realized that my job in growing food isn't to grow plants. It's to create conditions via habitat and food that promote the growth of beneficial organisms, decrease the populations of harmful ones, and thus help promote the growth of plants. It's not me that's growing plants, it's the microbes that are growing plants. So, down to the all-important plants. Plants in a garden system are essentially the hub of life. And I show, again, kind of a complex picture here because I want to illustrate the complexity and everything that's going on underground that we can't see. This picture on the top left here is one that I took out in a cornfield with a grower that I work with. And if you if you tune in really close there, you can see that around those white corn roots, there's a thin layer of soil that's attached to the roots. This is called a rhizosheath. It's a thin layer of soil that's connected to the roots directly. And the way that it sticks to those roots is via those microbial glues, those root exudates that the plants produce that help stick those soil particles. And within those soil particles, around those soil particles, are tons and tons of tiny bacteria, fungi, actinomyces, maybe even nematodes that are helping cycle nutrients around the rhizosphere. Ultimately, plants is where it all begins. It's the fuel for the soil ecosystem, whether in the form of leaves and stems and dead plants that fall to the ground and are incorporated into the soil by earthworms and insects, or whether it be from the sloughing off of root cells as they die, or whether it be from the secretion of organic materials, simple organic compounds from the roots themselves. The importance of this zone, which is called, it has its own name, this area around where the roots are, that's like in the immediate vicinity of the roots, is called the rhizosphere. The importance of the rhizosphere for microbial life is absolutely immense. It's the zone of the greatest influence of plant roots. And without these plants, without this rhizosphere for organisms to live off of these sugars and organic acids produced, soil is essentially like a desert. You can think of the rhizosphere almost as an oasis in the desert. It supports all kinds of life that otherwise wouldn't be able to live there. There wouldn't be enough food there. Sugars and other substances produced by plants feed microbes directly. Roots and root hairs, which are those tiny, tiny little threads of roots at the very, very tips, help actually bind soil particles together into those aggregates that I talked about earlier. And they also, plants produce surface residues like leaves that help physically protect the soil surface. So when you have, that kind of natural mulch from plant leaves and organic matter falling from actual plants, it actually helps protect the soil surface from water runoff. It helps hold water in. It helps act as a natural mulch to keep weeds suppressed. If you think of the way things work in a forest ecosystem, for example, you go around and there aren't weeds growing. They're shaded out, they're covered by leaves, by pine needles, et cetera, that are falling to the ground and kind of providing this natural mulch. Next, I want to bring to the table the worms and arthropods. There's a lot of attention on earthworms in gardening, and I have to admit, I've got about 1,000 tiny little pets in my house right now. Starting a mini vermicompost worm bin. And that's a really, really great way to add organic matter into your soil and to add life into your soil to kind of jumpstart the system. And it's something that's really easy to do just in your home. And it's something that you can do to compost inside. You don't have to worry about a big compost bin outside. You can keep your worms nice and clean. You can get a vermicompost tea. And I would be happy to share some resources on how to make your own vermicompost bin really cheaply and really easily. So I will remember to add that to the end of my list. I didn't before. Anyway, back to worms and arthropods. These guys are the organisms that help create large pores or holes in soil. They create these biopores. If you think of an earthworm burrow, if you think of when I was gardening in Florida, centipedes almost filled that role. We didn't really have many earthworms, but centipedes actually burrowed through the soil and they would create these holes that allow water to infiltrate, that allow air to get down for gas exchange with roots and microbes, etc. In doing so and burrowing down, they help mix organic matter into mineral soil. I was shocked by this stat of worms being able to move up to 100 tons per acre per year of matter. 100 tons per acre per year. That's a huge amount of material to move. Charles Darwin wrote an entire memoir on earthworms. And earthworms essentially were like the original plows, kind of. They've been moving soil around, moving materials through the soil in a microscopic, or not microscopic, but small way forever. Beyond worms, other insects help to shred and chew up bigger organic materials like leaves, and make more surface area available for bacteria and fungi to act on them to decompose them further. And lastly, I can't ignore the predators. My husband is absolutely terrified of spiders, but I can't tell you how happy I am when I find spiders in my garden. Spiders help to eat some of those bad insects that harm your crops, parasitic wasps, things like that are so beneficial in your garden. A healthy soil food web will have all of those things in there. Now we're getting into the microbial, the microscopic bacteria. Bacteria are tiny, you can't see them. It's often easy to ignore them, but they are so important in healthy soils. They cycle nutrients, they immobilize. Immobilize means basically to take nutrients and bring them into their own bodies, into their own skeletons, and make them temporarily unavailable. But then when they're eaten by larger bacteria, or when they're eaten by nematodes or protozoa, those nutrients mineralize. So they turn from bacteria exoskeleton into plant available nitrogen, just like that. And the life cycle of these organisms is relatively short. So although they might immobilize nutrients for a short period of time, there's a constant turnover of these bacteria, making available again nutrients when the plants need them. They have multiple different ways of increasing nutrient availability. What do I mean by this? They transform organic nitrogen into mineral nitrogen. So they break down amino acids and proteins into mineral nitrogen that's available for plants to take up. They help to dissolve phosphorus. Phosphorus is really, a lot of times there's a lot of phosphorus in soil, but it's really hard for plants to access it because of the form that it's in. Bacteria can change the form of phosphorus into phosphate and make it available for plants. And they can also do what's called chelating. They chelate micronutrients. Essentially, they attach molecules to it and make micronutrients more available to plants as well. This next one is perhaps the most famous of bacterial contributions to soil and soil health, but certainly not the only one. They fix nitrogen. Nitrogen is ubiquitous, literally. 78% of the air that we breathe is nitrogen, but it's in the form of N2, or nitrogen gas. It's completely inert and we can't do anything with it. We don't have the ability to turn the nitrogen gas that we breathe into proteins for our cells. But the really cool thing is that rhizobia, a specific type of bacteria that you can see in this top right hand, I keep pointing to my screen like you'll be able to see it. Rhizobia that form these nodules in certain types of roots. You can see in this picture below here as well, nodules. Plants house these nitrogen fixing rhizobia in these tiny nodules. They literally build a home for these bacteria to fix nitrogen on their roots so that they can get nitrogen. And then they, not only do they make a house for the bacteria, but they also feed them directly, a direct line of sugar to those rhizobia bacteria. It's a pretty amazing relationship that legumes have. So you're probably most familiar with beans and peas in the garden. Those are able to fix nitrogen. And there are also other families of plants that are not legumes that have similar relationships with a different type of bacteria, but they also form nodules and they're also able to fix nitrogen. So if you're thinking about including different fruiting shrubs into your garden, things like seaberry, things like buffalo berry, things like alder, they have relationships with bacteria that also fix nitrogen and help build soil. Certain types of bacteria, like actinobacteria, which you can see on this top left-hand corner, it kind of looks like fungal hyphae, like these thread-like forms, but it's actually a type of bacteria. They help break down some of the most complex organic materials you can find, like lignin. Lignin is really commonly found in wood, and it's really, really notoriously difficult to break down. But certain bacteria are specialized to do that. And lastly, second to lastly, a lot of bacteria secrete compounds that help soil aggregates stick together. So they secrete glues that help stick soil particles together to increase aggregation, to increase habitat, increase nutrient holding capacity in soil. And lastly, there are some bacteria, and maybe you've heard of this sort of bug in the jug, and there are a lot of different products out there trying to sell plant growth promoting bacteria, PGPRs. But there are certain naturally occurring bacteria that actually help promote plant growth. A lot of times by the production of hormones that are similar, compounds that are similar to plant hormones that help improve root growth or improve shoot growth, improve a plant's ability to fight off pests. Pretty amazing. And then there are other bacteria that more indirectly promote plant growth by competing against disease-causing organisms. So the roles of bacteria are extremely diverse. To show a diagram here, a simplified version of the nitrogen cycle. Because so much of agriculture really thinks about nitrogen and the importance of nitrogen to plant fertility. And I'm not denying that fact, but I want to show here that it's not just about nitrogen, it's about the bacteria that transform that nitrogen. So everywhere you see a highlighted yellow here is bacteria. They are literally involved in every step of the nitrogen cycle. Every step. Without bacteria, we would not get the proper cycling of not only nitrogen, but phosphorus, micronutrients, etc. So bacteria are absolutely indispensable. Fungi. This is fun. So fungi, although actinomycetes or actinobacteria are important in breaking down lignin and some complex molecules, fungi are really the main decomposers of these complex molecules. Without fungi and forests, we would have miles high of woody material and woody debris because there's nothing else that can break it down. So they're extremely important decomposers that help kind of make some of those really complex molecules available as food, as more simple molecules for other organisms. I told you we'd come back to this. We talked about rhizobia with bacteria, and I told you we'd come back to mycorrhizae as well. Mycorrhizae are symbiotic fungi or mutualistic fungi. So that means that they form a necessary relationship with plant roots. So the mycorrhizae gain from this relationship, as do the plant roots. Both of them benefit. Now, what do the mycorrhizae do in this? Mycorrhizae help acquire nutrients. They're really good at scavenging, phosphorus especially, but also zinc. They increase the surface area of plants. So if you look at this picture on the right-hand side here, this is a little pine seedling. And in the green circle, you see kind of a rough area that covers the pine roots themselves. And in the yellow circle, those aren't pine roots. Those are mycorrhizae. Those are the hyphae, the roots of this fungus that are literally attached to the roots of the plant and help that plant acquire nutrients, acquire water, and increase that surface area and the ability of that plant to really thrive. These hyphae also help bind soil particles into aggregates again, and they're really important in communication between plants. Now, this one I think is receiving a lot more attention recently, the value or the importance of fungi, of mycorrhizae, in helping plants communicate with each other, whether it be about pest pressure and diseases. They can send chemical signals through their mycorrhizae to each other, or the presence of animals that are eating them, saying from one plant to another, hey, there's something eating me. You should probably start producing your deterrent chemicals, secondary compounds, et cetera, that will help protect you if they come to you. And there's increasing evidence in the field that fungi, that these mycorrhizae act as almost like an underground network, an underground internet between plants. And it's really, really amazing. I could talk for hours about mycorrhizae. They're incredible, incredible organisms. And I really highly encourage you, if this is something that interests you, to look further into it. I have a couple of resources at the end of this, and I'd be happy to share more if you're interested. Another function of fungi, in addition to decomposing, in addition to helping plants acquire nutrients, is that they compete directly with disease-causing organisms. If you have a healthy fungal population of beneficial fungi, then there's less room, there's less resources, food, water, etc., for those harmful organisms to come in. And this last one I throw in, it's not as common, but it's just really, really cool, is that fungi can actually be predatory. So fungi, this bottom photo here is an electron micrograph. So really, really, really tiny microscope picture of a fungus. So those like kind of thread-like things coming out, wrapping around and killing a harmful nematode. Fungus killing a nematode. That's so cool. Like fungus killing a worm. Nope. So fungi are extremely important again. And I think they're starting to receive more attention in the soils world and the plants world, but they deserve a whole lot more. Nematodes and protozoa. So these guys are a little bit bigger on the scale, the physical scale. They're not quite microscopic. A lot of times you can see them with the naked eye or just with the hand lens. And they get a bad rap. There are some parasitic or harmful nematodes and protozoa out there, both to humans and to plants. But in the soil, they play some really, really important roles. They feed largely on either organic matter, materials, or other organisms. And perhaps their most important role in the soil is as grazers. So similar to the way that cows will graze a field of grass, nematodes and protozoa will graze a field of bacteria, but that field is microscopic and it's underground. In so doing, in that sort of trophic situation in the soil food web, when they eat those bacteria, they help mineralize or make available those nutrients that were held up in the body of the bacteria or of the fungi. And they make those nutrients then available for plants. So they eat the bacteria, and then as they eat it, they excrete out these nutrients. There are estimates that 50% or more of nitrogen that's available to plants can actually come from nematodes feeding. That's a huge amount. So much so that they're thought to be responsible, between nematodes and protozoa, thought to be responsible for much of the nitrogen available in agricultural soil. It is important to mention that some can also be damaging to plants. But if you have an overall healthy population of these organisms, that is a lot less of a concern. So with that, I will open it up to some more questions. If you have any, Lauren.
Yes, I do. We've had some really good questions coming in. I want to kind of start at the top, I think. Let me get to the top question. So is the rhizosphere around plant roots non-existent or less in a chemical-based crop production compared to an organic-based crop production?
Good question. The rhizosphere will always exist, regardless of how chemically intensive or not a system is. There's always some effect of the rhizosphere. There's always some leakiness from plant roots, but the healthier and the more well managed your plants are in terms of soil health, the more healthy that rhizosphere will be, the higher the amount of the exudates that'll be produced. So there is some research out there, and it makes a lot of sense that when plants are spoon fed with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, as is the case often in chemically dependent systems, plant roots don't need to work as hard. They don't need to depend on bacteria and fungi to make nutrients available because we're giving them to them, right? So why would they waste their precious sugars to feed microbes when they can just take the nitrogen? So there is a lot of evidence that they'll produce a lot less exudates and there'll be a lot less thriving of a rhizosphere ecosystem in that case than in the case where you are feeding the soil rather than feeding the plant.
Okay, that's great. So another question kind of along that line, what's the best way to increase the beneficial fungal growth in the soil?
So that is another case where adding organic matter. Adding organic matter, especially carbon materials, will inevitably increase your fungal populations. That being said, fungus is a lot more susceptible to damage and population reduction when there's tillage involved. Those hyphae, those fungal roots that get sent out are really, really sensitive to disturbance. So if they're broken down enough times, it really prevents their growth and really reduces their growth. So reducing tillage and disturbance and adding organic matter are two really great ways to increase fungal populations.
Great, perfect. Now someone at the garden is always talking about biochar, and is that something you could talk about?
Yeah, I can talk a bit about biochar. So there's some controversial research about biochar and its effects. But essentially biochar, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is produced by the slow pyrolysis. So it's not burning, but it's a slow kind of charring of organic materials, any kind of organic materials, to produce a really, really lightweight, really, really complex pure carbon material that has all of this crazy structure in it that is negatively charged. So that negative charge leads to a really high cation exchange capacity or ability to hold on to positively charged nutrients, and also ability to hold on to water. So you can almost think of biochar as like a sponge in soil. Biochar, however, does not contribute nutrients itself. So I've found in my experience, and I can't speak to this in a research sense, but in my experience, inoculating or adding alongside biochar high nitrogen compounds like manures, even urine, things like that can help balance that out and provide a really stable source of carbon at the same time as providing kind of a sponge with preloaded nutrients on it. Biochar has also been shown to alkalize soil, so bring up the pH of soil. It has a liming effect that I think has been shown to be important in acidic soils, and it's something that I'll probably experiment with up here in the north, where my soils are pH of 5.5 or 6. So biochar has a lot of potential. And again, it's something, if you're interested, let me know, reach out. I can send some resources your way because there's a lot of research out there. It's an ancient technology that's been used for thousands of years to improve soils.
Great. Okay, that's cool. Just a couple more quick questions. So we don't want to disrupt our soil. How do we weed without disrupting the soil?
That's a good question. So some techniques are available for really shallow weeding. I mean, ultimately, I think two strategies are most effective in this. One is mulch as much as you can, so you get as few weeds as possible. Try and eliminate potential sources of weeds. So be really careful about what organic materials you're adding, especially like manures and things that can contain a lot of weed seeds. And get them when they're young. Weeds are a lot easier to get when they're yay high and only have 2 leaves and their roots are really, really shallow. You can just get them with a quick pass of a shallow hoe or even pull them manually. And another method for reducing them to begin with, especially if you're just getting started on a garden space, is using a technique called sheet mulching. It's a really, really effective way to prevent weeds from the very beginning.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. And so back to that kind of, remember we were talking about tilling, not tilling. And so is it best just to lay the compost on top of the soil or would you work it in gently? Any thoughts about that?
I guess it depends. If you're using compost as mulch, which a lot of no-till growers do, leaving compost on the top is a really good strategy, both for feeding the plant slowly as you're watering, and also for the added benefit of preventing weeds from coming up. If you are mixing it in very shallowly.
Okay, great. And then so back to the biochar, could that be harmful in our high pH soil?
That's a good question and something I need to research a little bit more. I think that the liming capacity of biochar is a little bit more buffered than something like adding lime because it's a carbon-rich material. But if the person who asked that wants to shoot me an email, I can do a little bit of research on that because I'm actually not 100% sure on that answer.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Super. And then just the last one. So when the nitrogen gets stored in the leguminous plants, is it only made available when the plant dies, or is that nitrogen available while the plant's still living?
That's a really good question. And the answer is kind of both. So a lot of the nitrogen becomes available when the plant dies, especially if you're using it as a cover crop, cutting it essentially when it would be the highest feed value for animals. Before it goes to flower and seed, it's going to provide the most nitrogen because once those legumes start flowering and going to seed, it puts all of its nitrogen in the form of protein in that seed. That's why beans are so high in protein. But if you catch it before, you get a lot of that nitrogen bound up in the leaves and the stems, etc. But there's also something really cool that happens in legumes, and it's called the leaky pipe hypothesis. And the idea is that when legumes when rhizobium bacteria produce nitrogen in nodules, there's some that leaks out. It doesn't all go to the plant. There's some that leaks out into the rhizosphere there. So you are getting benefits directly in that way as well.
Awesome. No more questions, but the comments are pouring in about how helpful all of this is, Jackie. So this is great. And if you want to move on, I think we're good to go.
Awesome. How are we doing on time, Lauren? I've got probably 15 more minutes of slides. Is that okay? Or?
Yeah, I think let's just go ahead. We still have pretty much everyone's hanging on, kind of glued to the screen. So
okay.
Just keep going. And if people have to leave, they can leave and watch it later. We are recording.
Okay, awesome. So the third and kind of final portion of my presentation is trying to understand how we can tell if our soil is healthy. So we've talked about what makes a healthy soil. We've talked about who some of the players are that are really integral in making healthy soil. But now I want to kind of shift to, okay, so I've learned all of these things. I know what the benefits are, but how do I know if my soil is healthy? Or if somebody asks me, they're starting a garden, you all, it sounds like are kind of experienced gardeners for the most part and have a lot of expertise to share. Soil health is becoming really popular. Someone comes to you and says, hey, I want to start a garden. How do I tell if my soil is healthy? I have some quick like in-field kind of assessments or tests that I've used and that you can use pretty easily to determine, generally, not quantitatively, but generally how healthy your soil is. So health, whether you're talking about soil health or human health, can't actually be measured directly. So we don't have like a 1 to 10 scale of how healthy is Jackie Jameson. Like I'm a 5.85 today. Better than yesterday, 5.7. Like that doesn't exist. But what we can do is measure our heart rate, measure our blood pressure, take our weight, look at our height, look at that ratio, all of those things. So in human health, or in soil health, as in human health, we look at indicators to assess how well a soil is performing its important functions. So coming back to full circle to the beginning of the presentation, when we talked a little bit about what some of those important functions of soils are, these indicators or visual assessments can be used to look at how well a soil is performing functions. Particularly, what am I doing here? Particularly important are water storage and infiltration, nutrient cycling, and habitat for soil organisms. Now we'll get into a couple of techniques that I use if I'm going out informally to work with a grower to see how their soil is looking, how healthy is their soil, or if I'm even going out. I recently bought property up here and I looked at probably 20 different sites before I settled on the one that I got. And every one that I went to, I would take a shovel and go down, look at the soil and get an idea of what I would be signing on to. So here comes a shovel test. It's really, really sophisticated method for looking at soil health. Totally kidding. So literally this is take a shovel, take whatever you have, even if it's a garden trowel, and dig down. Observation is your friend here. So taking a shovel full of soil and looking for things like, what does it smell like right when you dig it up? Does it smell like dead fish? Does it smell like nice earthy scent to it? What does it look like? Does it crumble apart when you dig it out? Does it form these like small aggregates or balls of soil when you dig it out? Or is it platy? Is it sandy? Some really simple observations like that. Do you see holes going through it? Indicating like worms maybe we're burrowing through? Do you actually see worms? Do you actually see insects growing in there? Is your soil covered? Things like that. There's a lot that you can tell just from a simple shovel full of soil. So as complex as a lot of this sounds, making healthy soil isn't rocket science. And the good thing is we don't have to do it. We don't actually make healthy soil. It's like we create the conditions. It's sort of I keep coming back to this field of dreams concept of if you build it, they will come. You create the best conditions you can for the soil, microorganisms, and plants and let them do their jobs. Getting into some more sort of specific tests that you can do in the field, we can look at how compacted our soil is. So simple things like putting a wire, like a metal wire flag or a shovel, putting it down into the soil. Can it easily penetrate the soil? Like, does it easily go into the soil? If so, that's a good thing. Or is there a point, maybe 6 inches, 12 inches down where you hit a hard point? Was your soil conventionally managed before and you're maybe seeing a plow pan, something like that? Those are things that you might want to address before you get really into gardening. Is like, do you have some really limiting factor that you're working with? And a plow pan could be something Another way of understanding how compacted your soil is to look at the plant roots themselves. Dig up a plant. If you don't want to dig up one of the plants that you're growing, dig up a weed. You're getting 2 for 1 in that case. You're weeding and you're also getting a better idea of what's going on in your soil. Are the plant roots growing in like a compacted sort of horizontal fashion, like on the right-hand side here? If you see your roots primarily turning off to the side as opposed to going down deep into the soil, there's evidence that you might have a compaction issue. So compaction a lot of times speaks to physical aspects of soil health. Compaction can derive from excessive traffic. So whether that be roads or even walking traffic, like in my gardens, it's a simple thing and it sounds kind of obvious, but I use permanent beds and I have a permanent walkway. And that walkway is the only place that I walk. I don't walk in my garden beds. Even that foot traffic over time can have a really substantial effect on compacting your soil. And traffic at non-ideal times, especially when you have wet fields and things like that, whether it be machinery or whether it be just humans walking over, can be really detrimental. Overgrazing or animals on the field at non-ideal times can lead to wet field or can lead to excess compaction as well. And ultimately, you're concerned about this because the structure is literally the physical medium in which your plants are growing. It provides habitat for soil organisms like we've talked about, and good structure, again, going back to that pie chart in the bottom 50%-ish of soil is made up of pore space. When you compact soil, you reduce that pore space and you reduce the ability of soil to act as a sponge for water, and you reduce the ability of a soil to exchange gases, which plant roots need, which microbes need, etc. So generally, when you're looking at a soil, whether it be in one of these tests or just pulling a shovelful out, a granular structure, so a well aggregated kind of mix of small and medium balls of soil, aggregates of soil, indicates a lack of compaction and generally a good structure. Some things to look for specifically. Do you see pores? Is it crumbly? Can you actually see aggregates? Like in this picture on the right-hand side here, we see, not only do we see some cute little earthworms, we also see plant roots. We can see those holes that worms were actually moving through. And we can see this kind of, this kind of crumbly structure of the soil. Those are all good indications. In addition, you can see that there's still residue on this. This soil is covered, physically armored from water, from damage. So now I'm going to look at some biological aspects of soil health. I mentioned this idea of a rhizosheath earlier, and you can see it a little better here now. So this is a set of corn roots. And you can see on this corn roots that thin layer of soil, that's the rhizosheath. That is rich in sugars and food and microbes and bacteria, etc. This is where we're seeing a healthy rhizosphere population of microbes, adequate food for microbes. The fact that it's sticking to the roots indicates to me that there's good amount of microbial glues, good amount of sugars produced by the plant roots that are sticking it to. So it's a good thing. These root exudates help feed all the microbes in the soil. And the other thing here on the right-hand side, this is kind of a blown up picture of the last one that I was showing, is you can look for a diversity of different organisms. So I remember when I was out in this field, I was looking at earthworms, obviously, the macro here. I was also looking at these bean roots. It was a bean plant planted in this field, and you can see those little nodules on there. I actually cut open those nodules, and you cut them open and they have this like dark pink color to them. And that dark pink color in the nodules, if you're ever curious whether your plants are fixing nitrogen, if you want to dig one up and pull off a nodule, cut it in half and look at it. If it's pink or almost like a red or maroon color inside, that indicates that your plant is fixing nitrogen. Well, not the plant, but the bacteria in there are fixing nitrogen. They produce, and it's really cool, they produce a compound called leg hemoglobin, which sounds a whole lot like hemoglobin, which transfers oxygen in our blood and is absolutely essential. And it also is what makes our red blood cells red. So it makes a whole lot of sense that these guys would be pink when they're active. So that's another thing we can look at. And in this pile of soil, I also found some nematodes. I could see them just with a hand lens, these white little tiny worms. So in this case, it's kind of a good indication that there are a lot of beneficial organisms in here that may be out competing harmful ones. And that's kind of the case in a healthy ecosystem. It's not that you're not going to have harmful organisms, it's that your beneficial ones are going to outcompete them. And just going back to earthworms again, earthworms are a really good indicator organism for healthy soil microbiome. So generally, if you have a good population of earthworms in your soil, it's an indication that you have a generally healthy soil micropopulation. They build structure, they promote diversity of microbial population. When they eat organic materials and soil, ingest it, they excrete it out with this nutrient-rich and microbe-rich excrement or castings that are used as this like black gold in gardening. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of them. Yeah, we went through that already. And the last thing that I want to talk here is in-field assessments to look at water dynamics and kind of an indication of organic matter. So one thing to look at, and this may be a little bit less relevant on smaller plots of land, but I think that the ponding would be relevant. Something I see in a lot of fields in southern Idaho is crusting. This sort of crusting over, cracking of the soil after irrigation or rainfall. This happens when water impacts bare soil and basically clogs the pores. So that soil, because it's not well aggregated, it falls apart immediately when it's impacted by a raindrop, and those tiny little soil particles fill up the pore space, that valuable pore space that I was talking about, that acts as a house for organisms, that acts as storage for water. And then it creates this relatively impermeable layer of like a hard crust on the surface that doesn't allow water to infiltrate. Water just runs right off. And ponding is kind of similar to this, but it's when water can't infiltrate at the rate at which it's applied, whether via irrigation or rainfall. And it also indicates a poor structure or low organic matter. As I mentioned, again, coming back to this organic matter concept, but organic matter contains organic acids that help break up some of this poor structure and allow water to infiltrate. And it also is a sponge, quite literally holding so much of its weight in water. It can just absorb that water as opposed to having it sit on the surface. And the last question is kind of a qualitative one rather than a quantitative one, but you can kind of get an idea of how much organic matter you have. Color is pretty directly related. Soil color is pretty directly related to organic matter. High organic matter soils will generally be darker than low organic matter materials. So that's a good thing to look at. And then this question of, again, how your soil smells. Does it have that kind of earthy, sweet smell? And lastly, and this is more of a management question, is your soil covered? Sounds really basic, but it's something that I look at every field I go out to. Is your soil covered? Could it be covered more? Could you be protecting both your soil and your soil food web more with coverage? And the last slide here, before I get to some resources and open up to questions, is kind of a teaser for your next week's session of how can you improve soil health. And we've talked about quite a few of these concepts before, but I do want to go through kind of this framework of general principles to keep in mind of how to improve soil health. Before I get into the specifics, I want to point out that improving soil health and fostering soil health, improving the soil food web is all about emulating nature. All the principles that I'm about to talk about come from healthy ecosystems in the wild. Basically, we're trying to create these conditions in a human ecosystem. If you think of it, we're trying to grow specific plants, but in order to do so in the most ecologically friendly, beneficial way to plants, humans, and animals, we're doing it in a way that mimics nature. It's simple. We're letting nature do the work instead of us having to calculate exactly how much every plant needs. We can let the microbes do that work for us. In addition, doing any one of these things almost always means doing multiple of them. So here we go. Let's talk about some of these things you can do to improve soil health. Keep the soil covered. Pretty simple. This can happen in a lot of different ways. It can happen through living plants, whether it be in the form of your plant that you're growing for food, your tomato plant, or if it's in the form of cover crops. A key thing that I incorporate in my gardening systems is that I plant my crops at a denser spacing than would generally be recommended. And this serves me two purposes. It closes the canopy faster to prevent weeds from growing up, and it also covers the soil faster in order to keep the soil temperature cooler and to keep moisture in. So living plants, mulch. Organic materials are generally the best kind of mulch because not only do they help keep the soil covered and protect it from the impact of rainfall, from the heat that you get from direct sun exposure, etc., but they're also feeding your soil. So using organic materials in your mulch helps feed the soil as well. Minimize soil disturbance. This is also something that we've talked about. This means reducing or eliminating tillage. This means maybe using permanent raised beds, which is what I do. It means minimizing traffic, establishing beds, for example, and not walking on them. It includes weed management that reduces disturbance as well. Things like using a stale seed bed method where you actually germinate your seeds on purpose ahead of time. Germinate your weed seeds rather, whether it be with a silage tarp or some kind of plastic covering to create conditions to encourage weed seed germination and then kill them, or cover them with a dark cloth mulch, something like that, before planting into. And last but not least, sheet mulching. I think this is in small spaces, for intensive gardening, perhaps the number one best way to establish a garden. Maximize biodiversity is the next one. So that this all comes down to the soil food web. If you build it, they will come. Creating diverse habitat via different plants, variety of plants, crop rotations, companion planting, interplanting, using cover crops when you're not otherwise planting other things, providing diverse input. So when we're talking about the quality of organic matter or organic materials that you can add, not just adding one thing all the time, one food source, because that encourages the growth of a certain types of organism that feed on that, but instead adding a diversity of different materials that feed a diversity of different organisms. And essentially thinking about the fact that having diverse plants in your system leads to diverse microbial life. Different plants produce different exudates, support different bacteria, support different fungi, etc. Maintain living roots in the ground. So we're starting to see trends here. A lot of the things that I'm mentioning, relay cropping, cover cropping, intercropping, things like that, having a crop rotation that uses different times in the growing season to have plants growing all the time or as much as possible. These things fall into multiple categories. And the last thing here, which is sometimes ignored and a lot of times harder to imagine in a small garden space, especially like a community garden space. But you can be creative here. This can be traditional livestock. It can be small animals like chickens and ducks, rabbits even. You can use movable chicken tractors, movable rabbit tractors, etc., to specifically integrate livestock in the beds that you need them when you need them. But it can also be worms. It can also be just promoting the micro livestock that are in your soil, that are in healthy soil. And so essentially, even if we're not growing animals, if we're not raising animals, whether for food, fuel, or food or fiber, as gardeners, we're all micro livestock farmers as well. And when in doubt, add organic materials. Jumpstart the system, accelerate succession. We're trying to mimic natural systems, but we're also trying to grow food, right? So we're trying to make that happen in a faster, more defined way than might happen in nature. So thinking of these strategies as ways to jumpstart the system and create the conditions for life. So with that, I will leave you with some resources. Don't feel like you need to scratch all of these down. It will be in the recording. And it will also, I can also send out an email to Lauren to share with you all if you'd like. And I went through a lot today. This is like my favorite topic to talk about. And any one of the topics could warrant an entire day's discussion or class. There's too much to list here. So if you're looking for specific recommendations or have specific questions, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is here, and I would be happy to chat with you some more. So with that, Lauren, I will end my presentation and open up to discussion.
Okay, Jackie, that's great. We had a few questions come in and they're super diverse. I guess I'll just start at the top. Someone's wondering if you could briefly describe or explain sheet mulching.
Yeah, so sheet mulching is also a lot of times called lasagna mulching. It's basically like making a lasagna out of materials that you probably wouldn't want to eat. So a lot of times what I've done with this is it's really effective in areas that you have like sod or some really thick grass growing. And what I do with this is I will first dig up, like take a pickaxe or something and roll up the sod in the area where I'm trying to sheet mulch. This is not necessary, but I feel like it adds extra, it kind of puts you a step ahead. But basically the concept is you cover an area with cardboard or like thick paper. Cardboard's the best material really. Overlapped quite a bit. And the idea is you're creating this kind of like light impermeable barrier that's eventually going to break down because cardboard's organic matter, right? Organic material. So it'll eventually break down. But you're creating this kind of impermeable to light so weeds won't grow through it. So you're starting off with a weed-free surface on the top of that cardboard. And then you're just essentially layering it with compost. Compost, other organic materials, and you can mix garden soil in there, etc., and creating this kind of, immediate raised bed scenario that you can plant into, and that's automatically already weed free.
Okay, that's great. One thing I do want to say is that we do have a description on the IFCGA website and the garden calendar that we had last week of how to sheet mulch. And so that might be a really good resource. This question just came in. I have several others also. Can I integrate cover crops with my tomato plants or squash plants in a raised bed?
Yes. Yes, I think that some of these longer lived plants like squash and tomatoes present a really great opportunity to incorporate cover crops and or short-lived annual crops. Like a lot of times I will actually incorporate a crop of like baby lettuces or baby greens that I'll plant a little bit before my tomatoes are going to go in the ground because they can tolerate some more cold. So I'll plant those in, and I'll get a crop or two of radishes, of baby greens before my tomatoes come up, and I get the added benefit of soil coverage during that time, extra living roots during that time. And then when I cut those plants back, the roots that are underground are going to decompose and feed my microbes. So you can do that with a crop that you're going to eat. You could also do that with a cover crop. In the case of a cover crop, you could plant it the same way earlier than you plant your tomatoes or squash. And then depending on the species and how basically resistant it is to shading out and how vigorously it grows, you may have to cut it back in what's called like a chop and drop scenario, where you cut it back and just lay it on the ground around your tomato or squash or things like that to feed the soil as mulch.
Okay, super. And then one person said, let's say you have a deep bed, a wide bed, it's hard to reach your weeds, you don't want to compact your soil to get to them. Is there any ways, you found to kind of weed these hard to weed places without compacting your soil?
Yeah. So even if your beds are too wide to actually reach the center of, that's my strategy has always been to design my garden beds such that I can reach across them. But there's some other really cool designs that you can use, one of which is kind of the keyhole garden idea, where you have like your bed itself is wide, but you have an access point that you can get to the inside and the outside, or like even just creating areas, whether it be defined by a like a flat stone or something like that, every 3 or 4 feet in your garden to allow you to just be very defined about where you enter that garden. So you're not walking all over it, but you're just using that one space, and maybe you sacrifice that and don't end up planting into it. Just kind of determine where you want to use for traffic and where you want to use for planting and kind of stick to that.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. Like a little stepping stone. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then last question is kind of way back when you had that picture of the roots and then they were growing out sideways. Can you explain what a plow or a hard pan is?
Yeah. So a plow or a hard pan, plow pans a lot of times used, or you'll see in areas that have been long-term moldboard plowed. So what you get when you plow down, you're only plowing to a certain depth, maybe 12 inches, something like that. And what you get is you get this sort of aeration and lightening of the soil above the plow, but below the plow, you're essentially pushing it down and compacting that soil below to create a situation where you're reducing your pore space. So that's where you'll get, 6, 12 inches down, and you'll feel that compaction layer down lower. It's just from that compaction of the physical machinery moving through the soil.
So would this happen with repeated tilling also?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, well, that's all the questions that we have. This has been fabulous, and I want to thank you so much for joining us. I think last week we did kind of open it up, let people unmute themselves. I don't want to soak up all your time, but maybe if you could go till noon, we could, if anybody had any questions, that's just 15 minutes. If people want to unmute themselves and put themselves on video. And if not, that's fine too. This has been amazing. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to stick around for a little while.
Okay.
Lauren, you have to invite them to unmute themselves.
Okay, Christy. Maybe
I'll start doing that as well, just so if
Okay.
they want to, they can.
So I think I have to go up to view
Participants.
Okay.
And if you just click on ask to unmute, then they can do that if they wish.
Okay, let's see. Participants. Okay, and then just unmute them, and that's what you're doing?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just giving them the option to unmute if they want to.
Okay. And maybe we will, maybe we won't. We had some good, robust questions, so.
Yeah, I know this format can be kind of tricky sometimes, but thank you for all the good questions. There were a lot of great ones out there.
Oh, yeah, I thought so too.
Hey, I do have a question.
Go ahead.
So I'm new to high tunneling, and I will be high tunneling this year. And so I wondered what the biggest difference is between high tunneling and just regularly gardening, where you've got full sun, and then you've got, the high tunnels were more of a desert atmosphere, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's a good question. Water management, I think, is probably the single biggest difference between high tunneling and managing just out in the open. Water management, addition of water is all on you at that point. So it becomes really key to be efficient in your water use. I found that in high tunnel growing, drip irrigation is super key and really beneficial. So irrigation, both timing and use, and to go along with that, the importance of organic matter becomes even greater.
Okay. The other question I had is, in high tunneling, how important is the soil makeup? Like organic matter, that sort that we talked about today. How much I need to do before I tunnel up? I guess you could say.
Sorry, you went in and out a little bit there. Before you what?
So before I put the tunnel up, because I don't have it yet, I'll be putting it up this spring. And so how much preparation do I need to do to, either fill the soil up or put organic down or sheet?
Wow, very bad audio.
Sheet it or things of that sort before I can, just regularly plant and do.
Gotcha. I don't think, unless you're talking about moving materials in with equipment that can't get into your high tunnel, I would say that most of that work can be done once it's already built out, but you will want to do something ideally to work with your weeds, whether it be sheet mulching or stale seed bed or something along those lines.
Okay.
To be on top of weed management, because you are creating a microclimate in there. So you're going to be growing things both beneficial and potentially not beneficial faster than you would be outside. So being on top of that, and then also something to keep in mind, generally in high tunnels, you're able to grow a lot more intensively and for a longer period of time. So keep that in mind when you're considering your nutrient management. And the addition of compost and things like that you may need to account for greater amounts of organic material going into the soil in your high tunnel as opposed to outside, just by the nature of how much more material, crop material, you're potentially going to be pulling out of those fields or out
Sure.
of your fields.
Sure, that makes sense. The other thing too is the reason that I was getting the high tunnel is potentially trying to grow year round, so through the winter.
Mhm.
I don't know how much experience you guys have or resources you have for growing through the winter in Idaho Falls area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are some really great resources out there. Double cover. Are you going to be heating your high tunnel or no?
So I'm planning not to be heating it for the first part, just to see what I can grow without heating it. But I'm going to do a double plastic with the fan in between the plastic. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So crop selection is huge.
Yeah.
Plants don't really grow a ton when the days are super short. So it's more about planting what you'll need and be harvesting throughout the winter earlier in the season, and it just kind of overwintering in those conditions, if that makes sense. Double covering, so using row covers and such, even low tunnels within your high tunnel can help extend your season even more. And some great resources. I'm not sure if you're already familiar with Elliot Coleman. He's done a lot of work in Maine and is kind of the guru of season extension and unheated tunnel growing. So I would definitely suggest reading up on some of his stuff.
Okay. Perfect.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Jackie, I have a question for you.
Yes.
I am thoroughly, what's the word? I got excited about your numbers that you did with the organic matter.
Okay.
Where do I find the resources for that? And also, can you help me understand what 1% of organic matter is? Is that 1% of my soil? Like, if I'm growing on an acre,
Mhm.
how much organic matter is that on that acre?
So have you ever gotten a soil test done?
No.
So if you were to get a soil test done, one of the numbers, even in the most basic soil test, would be your percent organic matter. And it's a percent lost on ignition or percent LOI. And that percent will be your percent organic matter. So it's a percent of the total soil and that whatever depth your soil sample was, that is organic matter, that is like carbon rich materials.
Okay. Okay, so
So-
then adding that amount?
Yeah, well, so that's talking about organic matter that's actually in soil. So your soil is 5% organic matter over a year, maybe 1% or maybe 20%. So 1% total would mineralize in a year. And that mineralization or that breakdown of that organic matter would produce that 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen, 5 pounds of phosphorus, et cetera, the numbers that I gave. And the key though is that you're not just depleting that resource, that 3% organic matter or whatever percent you're at, because you're constantly adding organic materials that replenish that supply.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And Jackie, I don't know if you or anyone else has seen that movie Kiss the Ground with Woody Harrelson.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see that?
Yeah.
Did you think that was worthwhile? It's kind of
Yeah,
talks
it
about
was a
what
good
you
one.
talk about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I didn't even touch on it today, but there's so much out there and there's so much interest more recently about the connection between soil health and human health that I think if that's something that you're interested in, there are a lot of resources out there that have some really fascinating information about the importance of the soil microbiome to our human gut microbiome, et cetera.
Oh yeah, that's big stuff right now for sure. Yeah.
Um,
Well, thank
Jackie and all of our folks who are still there. Jackie went over those 5 key components at the very end of her presentation. And I just wanted to remind everyone that on the website, there is a link to Dr. Buzz Klut's little mini videos about those 5 soil criteria that you're trying to achieve. If you just go to the website and look at our Healthy Soil link or to the class schedule, underneath that, there are a list of links and Dr. Klut's videos are there as well. And they're 5 or 6, just 4 or 5 minute videos that will just reinforce the message that Jackie's shared with us today. And they're really very well done, compact, but very informative.
Yeah, Christy, thanks for pointing that out. There are a lot of other valuable resources on the IFCGA.org website. And next week, we're going to do Soils 2, Building Your Soil. And this is recorded. We'll kind of get it edited up and up on the website for people to see. And maybe without further ado, we can adjourn.
Lauren, can we just cease recording here? Keep
Yep, you bet.
Jackie on after everybody's gone, because I'd like to talk to her for a minute.
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.